Imagine waking up one morning as a prince, with palaces, servants, and 6 centuries of royal history behind your name. And by nightfall, you are in exile with nowhere to go. That is exactly what happened to the princes of the Ottoman Dynasty in 1924. And their story is one of the most dramatic falls from power in all of modern history. The House of Osman ruled for over 600 years, from the late 1200s all the way to 1922, making it one of the longest-ruling royal families the world has ever seen. At the peak of their power, the Ottoman sultans lived inside the Dolmabahce Palace, a building so enormous it had 285 rooms, 43 grand halls, 68 toilets, and 6 Turkish baths, all decorated with 14 tons of gold leaf. Thousands of servants, guards, and staff lived inside the palace walls, with the Topkapi Palace compound alone covering over 700,000 square meters, roughly the size of 100 football fields. The imperial household's annual budget in the late 1800 consumed a massive share of the entire Ottoman government's yearly income, funding ceremonies, fleets, courts, and a way of life that had continued for 6 centuries without interruption. But on November 1st, 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly voted to end the sultanate, and the last sultan, named VI, fled Constantinople on a British warship and never came back. His cousin Abdülmecid Roman II was briefly kept as caliph, the religious leader. But that title was also abolished just 2 years later, in March 1924, by Mustafa Kemal's government. And with that abolition came a law that changed everything for every prince still living in Turkey. They were given as little as 24 to 48 hours to leave the country. Every palace, every estate, every bank account, every piece of property inside Turkey was seized by the state. The princes could take only personal belongings, whatever they could carry, and then they were gone. Hundreds of members of the House of Osman suddenly scattered across the world with almost nothing. To understand just how shocking this transition was, think about what these men had grown up expecting from life. These were not simply wealthy men. They were men who had never needed to think about money, survival, or ordinary work for a single day of their lives. One of the most well-documented cases is that of Osman Fuad Efendi, a grandson of Sultan Murad V, born in 1895 deep inside the imperial household. He had been raised as a prince, educated as a prince, and fully expected to live as a prince. But after 1924, he ended up in France working ordinary jobs just to support himself as the decades passed and the money ran dry. His story was not an exception. It was the standard pattern for an entire generation of displaced royals. Then there is the case of Osman Ertugrul Efendi, born in Istanbul in 1912, only a child of 12 when the exile decree was passed. For most of the 20th century, he was considered the senior male heir of the entire dynasty, the man who would have been sultan if the vote of 1922 had never happened. He settled eventually in New York City, living not in a palace but in the ordinary apartments of everyday American life. Reports from people who met him in his later years describe a man of great personal dignity and quiet calm, but also a man who, at various points, held positions in retail and ordinary commercial work just to pay his bills. He died in New York in 2009 at the age of 97, having outlived the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and dozens of countries whose borders had been directly shaped by the empire his family once controlled. Not every exiled prince ended up struggling. Those who had already moved money into European banks before the exile, or whose mothers came from wealthy outside families, were able to build comfortable lives abroad. But for the majority, whatever resources they carried out of Turkey could not stretch across generations of displacement. Across the 20th century, researchers and family historians documented something that would have been almost unimaginable a generation earlier. Ottoman princes working as taxi drivers, restaurant workers, shopkeepers, and low-level clerks in the countries that had taken them in. Imagine carrying a name that had commanded the armies of 3 continents, then having to explain that name to a curious employer in a foreign city while filling out a job application. That psychological weight, the gap between who your bloodline said you were and the life you were actually living, runs through the memoirs and oral histories of that generation like a quiet, constant ache. But here is the part of this story that most people miss entirely. The Turkish Republic could confiscate the palaces, the land, the money, and the titles, but it could not confiscate what was inside these men's minds. The Ottoman dynasty had always invested heavily in educating its members. and that education turned out to be the most durable asset any of them could carry across any border. In the countries where they eventually settled, descendants of the dynasty became doctors, lawyers, architects, academics, and artists, people who rebuilt their lives not through inherited wealth but through inherited knowledge. The exile law began to be reversed in stages. Female members of the dynasty were allowed to return to Turkey and reclaim citizenship in 1974. The full reversal for male members came only in 1992, nearly 70 years after the original exile, when the Turkish government finally allowed all surviving descendants to apply for citizenship. By that point, the older exiled generation had largely died abroad, and 3 full generations had grown up outside Turkey. Today, the senior representative of the House of Osman is generally considered to be Dündar Ali Osman Osmanoglu, born in 1930, who has spoken to Turkish media about his family's history over the years. The wider diaspora, numbering in the hundreds or low thousands across all family lines, is now scattered across Turkey, Egypt, France, England, and the United States. Some still maintain formal connections through the House of Osman Foundation. Others have assimilated so fully into their host cultures that their only link to the empire is a story told at a dinner table. And that is the image this story ultimately leaves us with: one of the greatest ruling dynasties in human history, reduced not to ruin, but to memory. 600 years of sultans, armies, and palaces, carried forward now in the only way great things eventually survive, not in stone, but in the people who remember them. If this kind of hidden history is what you are here for, the next video on this channel will take you somewhere just as unexpected. Do not skip it.